let's talk about why I'm here. So, how many of you have done add-in development with Office? Okay, a few of you. And are all of you familiar with the Microsoft Graph and kind of the concept we've been talking about a lot at this build? Okay, the keynotes and everything. Okay. So I'm here to talk about a new flow that we're introducing for add-ins, which is called the single sign-on flow. And we're introducing a new API for you to be able to do single sign-in with add-ins. And the reason why this is important is because if, for those of you who have done add-ins before, or if you have partners who have add-in platforms, today when you run an add-in, the add-in doesn't know who you are. Office doesn't tell the add-in anything about who you are. And so there are a number of partners who would love to know, like, hey, I want my add-in to know who the user is so I can make decisions, show them special information from my service, things along those lines. And we actually have some APIs and some methods that people have used to try to get authentication working within an add-in. So we introduced a dialog API once upon a time that would let you pop up a web auth flow, do a flow, kind of get the user's auth, and then return it back to the add-in. So we've done that in the past. But the challenge with that is I have to sign in again. Like I have an add-in, but then I have to have the user sign in again. And that user's already signed into Office. So why do they have to sign in again? I just want to use that Office user. So the new API that we're introducing, that is in preview for build for on Win32 desktop clients of Office for organizational accounts. Those are my caveats. It allows you to automatically take that Office identity and flow it into your add-in so that you can make subsequent calls to the Microsoft Graph. So that's what we're going to do. And this, assuming this finishes in time for me to show the demo, I'll show it later, and everything will be great. In the meantime, I will pretend to be my slides, and I will go to this whiteboard. So the first thing you need to know, the API is fairly simple. OK. There's our API signature. Get access token async. It is part of the office.context.auth namespace. This API is pretty standard for anyone familiar with add-in APIs today. So it takes an options parameter that lets you do a few special case scenarios if you need to handle certain auth exceptions. So if you need to pop up a consent prompt for the user, or if you need the user to change their Office sign-in account, we have options to let you do that with the API. So the first parameter is just options. And then the second parameter is your standard callback function that we call when the operation's complete. And I won't write out all the source code here. When this thing gets up and running, I'll just show you kind of a signature of what it is. But this is totally standard API signature for add-ins. So what that means is result.value will contain the token that you requested, and result.error will have any information if something went wrong, so you can inspect what happened and dig into it and try to solve the problem for the user. So the API signature is relatively easy. It's relatively simple. But what is more difficult is how do I even do auth? How do I conceive of auth with an add-in, and how do I just make it work? If Office has the user signed in, how do I get that user to show up inside of my service within my application? So I'm going to draw some pictures. So if this is Office, we'll just say Office here. There are a bunch of other components involved in making this all work. One will be your add-in service, which is connected to your add-in. I'm just going to use a task pane example here, but it could be a content add-in, whatever you want. Now, your add-in is defined in the Office store, right? And in the Office store, your add-in has a manifest, some file here. What's new to this flow is this concept of bringing an Azure application in with the flow. Because when we talk about single sign-on, when we talk about authentication with Office, we're talking about Microsoft identities, which are supported by Azure Identity Platform. So in Azure, I also need an application. And this application basically represents this service. So Azure knows what your application is. Office knows what your application is. And in both places, you do some special configuration steps. I will also show those when this completes. But there's basically some metadata here that you want to write down in your add-in manifest. And there's some metadata that you want to write down here in your Azure manifest. The way this flow works, just kind of a high-level overview, is that your add-in, once you adopt the API and build your infrastructure, your add-in basically says, hey, Office, get access token async. It asks Office for a token. Then Office goes up to Azure and gets a token for you. So that's the first step. Basically, Office, because it knows who the user is, uses that information and goes to Azure and says, hey, I want to get a token. But it gets a token to your add-in service, which has been designed and defined in Azure. It just gets a token for that. The next step is that once this comes back, we give it to the add-in, then your add-in can flow it to the add-in service. Basically, Office gets a token that says, hey, a user showed up. It wants to use your service. Here you go, add-in service. Take that token. And so now your service, via your add-in, has retrieved a token from Office that it can use. Basically, oh, this is the user trying to use my service. But what's new to this flow, both for what the Azure team has done, the ID platform team has done a bunch of work around the new converged endpoint to support an on behalf of flow. And what your add-in service can then do is say, hey, this token from Office, I can exchange that. I can go back up here and exchange it so that the token is no longer an Office token. It's now my token. I exchanged it to talk to the graph. That brings something back. And once I do that swap, I can go talk to the MS graph. All right. My computer is back. Let's sign in. And then I'll show you the demo, which is the next part of this talk. I am.
You want me to switch you over now?
Let's just let it sign in, and then we'll get it going. So one thing I do want to say is that if anyone had any questions along the way, like, please just ask the question. Yes?
Are there options for specific access, or is it just carte blanche, if anything?
Yeah. So the question was, are there options for specific kinds of access? So the way that this works, and the way I'll show you, is that all of the permissions, what you request, you basically define in the add-in manifest. So what you'll say is, for this SSO flow that I want to support, my add-in declares that it wants to do user.read, files.read.all, context.read, right? And that you kind of declare that up front. And so when the flow goes through, Office makes sure that the user consents to that set of permissions. And then when you do the token exchange, you get a token back with those permissions. Sorry, my computer just went to sleep while it was patching. OK, sorry, that was one question. Next question. No. So, sorry, this is the Azure identity platform. So this is Azure's authentication and token endpoints and everything that goes along with it. The point here is that because Office uses Microsoft identities, what you need to do is declare that you have an application that lives in this Azure application ecosystem. And that's why you register just this application object. And I will show you the Azure portal where you actually can register these converged applications. Any other questions? Yes?
So, does that flow work with the third-party IDPs, for example, Federation?
So right now, and so this API is just in preview, and it can mature. And part of the reason why we're releasing it now is because we want people to try it out, to go back, experiment with their add-in platform, and see how it works. Currently, the only identities that Office understands that it can sign into are Microsoft identities. So if you still have kind of a third-party identity provider, there are two options. One is you use what we have today, which is use the Dialog API, pop up, sign into the third-party IDP, get the token back, and work kind of independently from Office. It's not really single sign-on in that case. The other option is that you do some sort of federation. Essentially, if you support, we can get you tokens to a Microsoft account that the user signed into. If your service supports like token identity binding or federated identity with a Microsoft identity, then when I provide you the identity, you can still go, oh, I know who that user is in my system, and then you follow through with Azure, but you're just identifying the user based on a Microsoft identity. All right. We are up and running. The add-in can be side-loaded or in the corp cat. The deployment mechanism that you want to pick is up to you. The benefit that we have today of an Office Store submitted add-in, which, by the way, you cannot submit any add-ins to the store that do this yet, because this is a preview API, so you're not there yet. But the benefit of the store is that if we know you're in the store, then we can kind of vouch for your add-in, and we present the consent experience to the user as they acquire your add-in. If you do it through CorpCat or kind of a side-loaded thing, you have to handle the consent yourself. And typically what that means is you need an add-in for your organization to kind of consent on your service's behalf. Does that make sense? If it goes to the store, the whole flow, the consent and token acquisitions, everything included. But if you do CorpCat, then you already have to do admin approval, because that's the way CorpCat works, is that admin approval is part of the process to get it in your organization. If you just do a side load, then like as a developer for your developer tenant, it's not a big problem. You just do it within your own tenant. But if you work with a customer, you have to say, hey, customer, this is how you consent to my application so that it works with SSL. Yes?
Can we use the usual way of detecting requirement?
Yes. Yeah, the API is part of a requirement set, and you can do it either statically or, with the dynamic. Yes. Yeah, and so that's an important thing, because obviously a bunch of people already have auth mechanisms in place or have different auth options they want to use, and this way they can interrogate to see.
Right now we're using Dialog API, right? So
right.
what we would do is check this, and then if it's available, use that, and if not, use Dialog.
Yep. I'm going to make sure that I'm signed in with the right user in Office. I am. OK, great. Let's start debugging. Again, my apologies for the reboot and update delays. Okay. Starting up. Because I had to do this from scratch, there will be a little bit of latency, and I apologize for that in the loading of this. Also, because this is being developed locally with SSL, we have to do this little refresh game to let IE trust that I really do want to load this add-in. OK, memory spiking. That's good news. And so as I do this demo, it'll actually kind of pull back through all of the things that I've been talking about. So I have a few debug breakpoints at key parts of what this thing is doing. And then at each of those breakpoints, I'll kind of explain like how is the solution designed and what is it doing, so you can understand how it works. All right, so I have some really simple SSO sample in PowerPoint. All it basically does is asks Office for the token that I talked about before, does the exchange with your service, and then does a call to the graph. OK, first step, got the access token from but did not hit the breakpoint. That's OK. I'll still just show you the code. So this is what I described before, office.context.auth, get access token async. It's pretty straightforward. Access token is returned in the result.value if it works. And if it doesn't work, you want to handle error cases. We already have documentation, and it's in the slides. We already have a documentation online that will explain kind of how you do this approach from kind of a 1,000-foot perspective. And then we have 2 code samples already published to GitHub that let you do this in a ASP.NET project with MSAL or as a pure Node.js project. But very simply, this is the new API in the add-in. That's basically all I have to do. Looks easy enough. But then we got to go to the next part, which is a little bit more interesting. So the next part here, this is where in my service, I get called, and I say, hey, my add-in just called me, and it wants to do a token exchange to get a graph token back. So what we're doing here is actually MSAL code and a little bit of higher-level auth code that's saying, OK, well, let's get this. Let's get the token. Let's check to make sure that the token that we got has access as user, which is the new scope that we defined for this flow. Once we have that, once we've verified, like, OK, this token has the permission I want for this token swap API, I establish a user assertion, which basically says, hey, when I do that token swap, I need to prove that the user is here so I can get a token for them. And so the user assertion is basically that token that got passed in, because Azure said, hey, here's a token that says the user is here, so I'm going to pass it back to Azure so I can swap it. Next, I do client credentials. So I basically have to prove to Azure, I have to say, hey, Azure, I really am the Agave service, and the user really did show up to my service. Please give me a graph token. That step is important because otherwise people could just, if they managed to get a hold of that first token, they could just impersonate your app. They could be like, oh, hey, I got this token from Office. I just want to pretend to call the add-in service. And that's bad news. And then using MSAL, which if you're familiar with ADL, you'll see that the API signatures are a little bit different. But I just call acquire token on behalf of async. And so I go do that call. I say, I prove that I am that service. I prove that the user showed up. In an exchange, I get back another token. And it's hard to see here on the screen, but basically the tokens begin to diverge at about this point. And they're diverging because this was the token that Office got for the add-in service. This is the token that the add-in service gets so it can talk to the graph. And now the last call is just, I want to get a list of files from the Microsoft Graph. So I click that third one. And this is just standard jQuery call to get some data from the graph. So you can see, I want to get my OneDrive files, list by name, do a get, go get them, passing in that graph access token as the Barrett header. And it will come back after a little bit of delay with a list of files that are in my OneDrive. If we had more time, I would have dynamically added a new file and proved to you that this is all real, but I assure you this is all real. So this is the demo. This is it working through. These are the 3 big pieces that's going to be important to everyone understand when they dig into the overviews. Do we post this video? OK, it's rebroadcasting on Channel 9. I did a pre-record for Build that already has a lot of the details that I spoke about here, which you can rewatch. In that pre-record video, I also have a link to all the documentation that will help you kind of drill in and see, like, OK, what's the overview? What are the samples? And really read into it. But again, the 3 key pieces are Office will get you a token now. You can swap it for a graph token. And once you have that graph token, you can do whatever you want. And now your add-in knows who is the user, and it can access anything in the graph on their behalf with one new API. I will pull up my slides just so I can do the trailing piece. Here. There are the pictures I drew. All right. call to action. Please think about your add-in and whether SSO would be useful for you. Does your service or does your add-in benefit from knowing who the user is and doing special things on their behalf? Then please consider looking into this API. It's already ready. It's in the GitHub documentation. It's in MSDN. There are samples ready. So as soon as you leave this talk, you can use it. Go ahead and build a prototype. And what I mean by that is this is a preview API, so I don't want you publishing this to your production version of the add-in. But certainly within your development environment, go do the flow, evaluate whether it works. If it doesn't work, let us know, let me know, comments on the video. We want to understand what kind of cases you run into. As everyone's familiar with, authentication can be a challenge. Vittorio, the expert in the back, can vouch for that. And hopefully with the new set of MSAL, with MSAL, the new library, you'll run into fewer problems. Next, send us feedback and suggestions, what I mentioned. And then finally, get your add-in ready for when we GA. So the idea would be if everyone gets to try it now and it gets it working with the flow, then as soon as we finish, as soon as we GA, you'll be good to go. You'll be able to update your add-in in the store and just hit the ground running, and you'll know who the users are that are running your add-ins. Next, I made this AKMS shortcut thing so you can just load up all of our documentation. So this is the overview documentation, and at the bottom of that document, there are 2 links to GitHub projects that you can use. Please ask questions on Stack Overflow. The big tag is Office Dev, but there are a bunch of different ones. However you need to reach us, talk about add-ins, talk about the API, ask your questions. I want to help. We also have our user voice. If there's something about the API that you think there's a little bit more, for example, the question around third-party IDPs, please ask. And then finally, I know we're at the very, very end of the conference, so none of you can go back in time. But when you look at this video later, or if you take a picture right now, these are the talks and the breakouts that you want to see. You want to look at the big one, the overview that actually had a mini demo of this and understand why do I care about O365 as a platform and add-ins. Next one is building better graphs with API to your organization on Microsoft Graph, because now that I'm unlocking the power of the graph, I want you to use it in your add-ins. Another one on Microsoft Graph, Vittorio's on understanding Azure authentication, because we're going to be bringing add-in developers. We're going to be bringing a lot of them into the Azure authentication space. And so this is the one you want to watch to understand how you're doing auth with Azure. And then finally, another example of OneDrive and SharePoint APIs in the graph. So please fill out an evaluation. It's OK if you ding me for the start and the whiteboard, but I hope that we still got a quick overview of what's going on here. And again, if you have more questions, I will still be here to answer them.